it's supposed to be fun, but I'll do my best. I'll do my best. Hi, everybody. Let me know if you can't see my screen with the red and blue on it. Those are my three topics: the untidy origins of the Articles of Confederation. And then I'll say a little bit about the Northwest Ordinance and spend most of my time on what went wrong, because as you know, in your standards for Texas, the question they want your students to be able to answer is what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So we'll be sure and talk about both of those things. But one of the reasons I really like talking about the Articles is that they do raise so many tough questions. Do you know, for instance, that the Articles were first proposed in 1776, but not adopted until 1781? So what took them so darn long? That's one question we'll take on. Another question is, everyone thinks they're terrible, and I want to know, well, if they're so terrible, why did these geniuses, the same people who wrote the Declaration of Independence, adopt them in the first place? So that'll be our second question, both of those under the heading Untidy Origins. And then we'll get into Northwest Ordinance, which is something that the Articles did do well, in my opinion, but we can disagree. And then finally, they are mostly known for what they didn't do. And so we'll talk specifically about what various people thought the Articles failed to do. So those are the four questions under three headings that I want to cover. And then I'm looking forward to talking to you about what James Madison thought was so bad about the Articles of Confederation that caused him to really be the guy who drafted the US Constitution to replace the Articles. So let's get started. I've promoted my book enough. Articles of Confederation. There's the three topics that I'm going to talk about, and you can hold me to it to say on that schedule. Under Untidy Origins, you all know that document. The same people who wrote it also decided at about the same time to have a confederation, obviously to make themselves stronger as they battled the British. And you see Franklin in the middle of the scene there. He drafted a very interesting proposed Articles of Confederation that would put the United States in an alliance, perpetual alliance, both offensive and defensive, with its Native American neighbors. This is one of those historical might have beens, a road not taken. This idea that we actually could have had, the U.S. could have had positive relations with the Indians. You may not agree that was a possibility, but Franklin thought so. But that early suggestion in Franklin's version, the Articles of Confederation, didn't make the final draft, although Indians' land, as you'll see, was a major part of this story. The person who wrote the Articles that would eventually be adopted was Franklin's fellow Pennsylvanian, John Dickinson. John Dickinson's big contribution to the vote in favor of independence on July 2nd, 1776, was to leave the room because he was against declaring independence, but he saw that the people of his colony, as well as most of the other 12, were for independence, and he yielded to their, he couldn't bring himself to vote for independence, so he walked away. But anyway, they said, well, John, come back because there's something else you can do for us, and that is draft the Articles of Confederation. One interesting thing about his draft of the Articles was that it was very non-gendered. That is, it said frequently he or she and him and her. It treated women as equals, which was a pretty strange thing to do, even in the summer of 1776, when they had just declared all men are created equal. But a scholar has discovered that Dickinson, although not a Quaker himself, he was really influenced by the Quakers, also known as the Society of Friends, a peace sect formed in England a couple centuries earlier. And so there was that other road not taken in the Articles of Confederation. You can already see why I'm saying untidy origins, because there's these cool little things that happened or tried to happen along the way. Well, now let's take this question of how is it that Dickinson could draft his articles of the Confederation. Franklin had drafted his even earlier. So we get them drafted in 76, but they are not ratified for another 4 years in 1780, when all of you know the war was almost over. What were the disputes? What was the holdup that kept that from happening? There were many, but only having half an hour tonight, I'm going to focus on the biggest one, which was not Native Americans themselves per se, but their land. This map by Samuel Morse's father, that is the guy who invented Morse code's father, was a big geographer, Jedediah Morse. And if you look at those, here, let me highlight it. If you look at the southern states in particular, they claim to go all the way to the Mississippi and really to the Pacific. So actually, those of you living in North Texas, you're in Georgia, according to their charter and according to their idea of things. And we have, here's a clear depiction of that. Well, actually, that's got state lines. Well, it's really clear with Virginia, as Virginia going on out indefinitely. So you had all these states. New York was one as well. It wasn't just in the South, with these sea to sea charters. And that was great for them, because once you steal land from the Native Americans who actually owned it, you notice this previous map I showed you, they kind of vaguely have Native nations out there. But these Native nations, they claim their territory as well. This is kind of a busy map that's going to appear in my book, but it's busy because it's a myth that Native Americans just kind of ran around hunting. They had their territories. They often battled. They disagreed over territories, just like in Europe, but they did have their claimed territories. But here's the point. Native American land became a dispute, an object of dispute among people in the US, because Virginia was excited to have this sea-to-sea charter, wanted to keep it, but people living in places like Delaware or Maryland or even Pennsylvania, which had a distinct western border just west of Pittsburgh, as you probably know, they said, no, all of that land farther out, that shouldn't go to Virginia and New York just because they claim it. That should go to the whole Confederation to be used, to be sold off, basically to pay for the Revolutionary War. And you can kind of see their point, except I, originally from Virginia, where Denver lives today, I will tell you there's a catch to that, which is the people who wanted all of that Western land to go to Congress to pay off the war debt. They were motivated by that, but they were also motivated by the fact that they wanted to speculate in Western land, just as Virginians and New Yorkers were doing. And so they wanted that land to be available for them to speculate in. And if you're a Delaware or Pennsylvania or Maryland land speculator, you know you're going to get a fairer hearing from Congress than you're going to get from the Virginia legislature, which wants to hog all that land for its own people. So this was a dispute among white Americans over who would get Western land. And it's really the main reason that it took so long to get all of the states. They required that it be unanimous, which is always hard. Finally, Maryland came in 1780, and they did so because they got a visit from Benedict Arnold, or at least the Chesapeake did. Benedict Arnold by that time had performed his treason and was a British general. And when this huge British fleet and army led by Benedict Arnold shows up in the Chesapeake in 1780, that's when Maryland knew that it needed to get with the program, and we've all got to hang together or we're going to hang separately. And Maryland finally signed off on the Articles of Confederation. The places like Virginia had said, we're going to give you that Western land, but we want to reserve some of it for our guys, our soldiers, and really our speculators. Anyway, Maryland finally did sign off, and so that's why we get the Articles of Confederation being ratified. I think I've been saying 1780, and I've been saying wrong, because it's January of 1781 that Maryland finally becomes the 13th state to ratify. And of course, 1781 is the year of the last big battle, not last battle, but last big battle of the Revolutionary War in neighboring Yorktown, Virginia. So really, you can't give the Articles of Confederation credit for winning the Revolutionary War because the 13 sovereign states won the war with some coordination from Congress. Congress, a lot of people would say this seems to be the case today. Congress at the time had the power to spend money, but no power to collect money. And so they just spent it like drunken sailors. They had to pay for the war, causing massive inflation because they're sending money out and not taking money in with which to retire all of that debt, ran up the huge debt, basically declared bankruptcy in 1780, all that. It's a mess, but they won without the Articles, basically because the war was almost over by the time the Articles were adopted. Well, there's a lot of provisions in the Articles of Confederation that if someone were to propose it today, you know, there's talk of reforming the Constitution, but no one wants to reform it in these two ways. One is one feature of the Articles of Confederation that really distinguished them from the Constitution was it could not be amended without the support of every single state. So imagine if we had that now. You know, with 50 states, you're going to have some quirky ones. And certainly I can imagine, for instance, that the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, would never have been ratified if it had required, I think there were about 45 states at that time, 46 or 7 states at that time. They never would have gotten all of them to do something as basic as guarantee half the population the right to vote. So that was one sort of weird thing about the Articles of Confederation. They couldn't be amended except unanimously. And in fact, they never were. There are 0 amendments to the Articles of Confederation from their 7-year lifetime, starting in 1781, as I've mentioned, and going up through 1788. The other, I'll say weird, there may be people in Texas who think this is a good idea. We can debate it when we get to Q&A. But the other thing about the Articles of Confederation is that they gave the Congress very little power. Remember, I said that throughout the Revolutionary War, during most of which the Articles of Confederation were not operative, throughout that period, Congress didn't have the power to levy taxes. Congress still didn't have the power to levy taxes even after the Articles were adopted. So it's kind of amazing that our federal government was truly federal those first 7 years, in that we were a federation more like the United Nations than like the modern United States, in that the central government wasn't really a central government. It was a place where people met and talked, but it wasn't, if you don't have the power to tax, you don't have much power. And the states didn't have that power under the Articles. And so it's reasonable of you to ask, why the heck didn't they give the Congress the power to tax? And I think the answer to that is the same answer I'd give to why they required unanimity to amend the Articles and therefore never amended it. And that is, it was the colonies that had, the individual 13 colonies that had rebelled against Britain. When Jefferson spoke about his country, he meant his state of Virginia. And so they had rebelled as colonies. Yes, they'd cooperated. You see that in the opening lines of the Declaration and the closing lines. But they, the last thing they wanted to do was exit the British Empire to form an empire of their own. And so they were really into leaving the sovereign power with the states. And they did that in the Articles by not giving the federal government the power to tax, and by giving any one state the power to veto amendments to the Articles. Okay. And yet they got a few things right. And one of the most valuable things they accomplished is in that same region I just talked about as the obstacle to creating the Articles and finally getting them ratified in 1781. What was then called the Northwest. You know, when you and I say Northwest, we mean Oregon and Washington. But what they meant was north and west of the Ohio River. It's the area that's filled in black here. And you see how it has kind of a raggedy bottom of that area. It's raggedy because that's the course of the Ohio River, separating Kentucky south of the river and Ohio, Indiana, Illinois above it. West Virginia is technically below the Ohio River, although it's more sort of at that point east of the Ohio. So anyway, that's why they called it the Northwest. And I think we can all agree the great accomplishment of the Articles of Confederation, the biggest, was, well, A, they did finish off the job of winning the Revolutionary War, give them credit for that. And B, in 1787, Congress, while people were meeting in Philadelphia to get rid of the Articles of Confederation, the old Congress under the Articles was meeting up in New York City and achieving their biggest accomplishment, the Northwest Ordinance. Having praised the Northwest Ordinance, I want to put one little asterisk on that, and that is one of the things that people praise when they praise the Northwest Ordinance was the abolition of slavery in that territory that I've got displayed in black here. And the caveat is that a friend of mine named Scott Harriman wrote a wonderful book called The Alchemy of Slavery, showing how slavery continued in the Illinois country that's now the state of Illinois. Look at the end date of that book, 1865. There were still slaves in Illinois in 1865, and in Ohio and Indiana, other parts of the Northwest Territory, almost as long. They found, we don't have time, I'll answer in Q&A to talk about how they did it, but they found loopholes to continue slavery. And the other thing I want to mention, just looking at the map again, it's important to notice that in 1787, Congress did try to abolish slavery north of the Ohio River, but within a few days of doing that, it started passing regulations for the territories coming in south of the Ohio River, the future states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Missouri. Missouri would be a problem, as you all know, but making provision for those more southern states, that is reaffirming that there would be slavery south of the river. So this was not the beginning of the end of slavery. This is the beginning of the end of the United States, that is in the Civil War, because Congress, in basically the same breath, abolished it in the Northwest and retained it in what they called the Southwest, because it was south and west of them. Okay, so these were problems that we'd notice later. I want to focus on the years that you see screening by there. 1783 is when the peace treaty between the United States and Great Britain was signed. In 1787, as you all know, was when 55 guys, and of course they were all guys, gathered in Philadelphia to write the Constitution. And they were there. I'm showing a doctor diagnosing a disease on the left, and a pharmacist. Yes, there were female pharmacists in a lot of the colonies, figuring out the medicine on the right, because we have to see the U.S. Constitution as a response to the Articles, as an expression of the belief of some Americans, not all, that the Articles had been a terrible failure. And so I thought the best way to understand the transition from the Articles to the Constitution would be to look at what they saw wrong with the Articles and how they fixed it in the Constitution. And maybe a good place to start that is with the part of the Constitution that many of you, like me, at some point had to memorize. And I want to pull out, these look like glittering generalities, and some of them are promote the general welfare, but some are quite specific, and they help us figure out what went wrong under the Articles, according to the people who wrote the Constitution. Doesn't that one sound like a glittering generality? Ensure domestic tranquility. Doesn't that sound like the farm family gathered by the fireside on a cold winter's night, maybe pause reading a book to the rest of us? But that's not at all what they meant, the authors of the Constitution meant, when they said in the preamble that one of their goals was to ensure domestic tranquility. Domestic meant within the country, the way we talk about domestic policy today. Tranquility meant, as it still does, peace. Ensure domestic tranquility means we want to give the federal government something that it never had during the Revolutionary War, and it never had under the Articles of Confederation, and that is the power to levy taxes. And one of our reasons for wanting to give the federal government taxing authority is so it can field an army. And one of the reasons to have an army is to put down rebellions. Many of you have heard of Shays' Rebellion in 1786 in Massachusetts, and probably just because we love the name given to it by so many of our rebellions are named by people who hated them. Pontiac's rebellion, the Quakers were kind of a rebellion. So many of our rebellions are named by the people that hated them. And Shays was a lot more than this one guy, Shays. And he wasn't really the big leader. There were lots of leaders. Whiskey Rebellion was over a lot more than whiskey. It's not like they wanted to drink. They were dealing with a tax on their whiskey, which was their livelihood. Anyway, for you, I want to contrast Shays Rebellion, which happened during the Articles of Confederation, to the Whiskey Rebellion, which happened just 8 years later, but after the Constitution was adopted, after the federal government could levy taxes and use that money to send an army, federalized militia in this case, to go put down the Whiskey Rebellion. They put down the Whiskey Rebellion with great ease. Not one of those American soldiers sent west to Western Pennsylvania to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. Not one of the American soldiers was killed. The Whiskey Rebellion basically evaporated when these smartly dressed and smartly trained and well-paid well-paid soldiers came out to put down the rebellion in 1794. Contrast that to Shays Rebellion just 8 years earlier. As in the Whiskey Rebellion, Congress adopted legislation saying, yeah, we're going to send an army up to Massachusetts to put down Shays Rebellion. But guess what? That army never took the field because there was no money in the federal treasury under the Articles of Confederation because the federal government didn't have the power to tax. And so they knew what you and I know, that they'd had a rebellion that the Congress was unable to help put down. The Massachusetts state government put it down themselves eventually. And they also knew if we give the federal government taxes, they can use that money to field an army to put down rebellions. They didn't know there was going to be one over whiskey in 1794, but they knew there'd be rebellions, not only by whites, but by African Americans. And speaking about state sovereignty, that's a line we're going to hear a lot in the 19th century as Southerners start talking about states' rights. But as much as those Southern governors in particular talked about states' rights, when push came to shove, that is when there were slave rebellions like Gabriel's Rebellion in Virginia in 1800, or the Denmark or the Lalonde Rebellion out on the Mississippi River in 1811, or the Denmark Vesey Revolts in South Carolina in 1822. These are all slave revolts. Nat Turner in 1831. We can flip over to another map to see the biggest slave rebellion of all, which only had a few slaves involved, but a lot of free blacks and a lot of whites. That is the John Brown takeover of Harper's Ferry in 1859. Why am I mentioning these slave revolts? Because even though the governors of those states always talked about states' rights, what's the first thing they did when they got a slave revolt? They picked up the phone. Well, they didn't have a phone. They had a telegraph by 1859. Before that, they didn't even have that. They sent messengers to call in federal troops. So one of the reasons for the Constitution was to have taxes, to field an army that can put down rebellions both by enslaved people and by angry farmers, as we saw in Shays Rebellion and in the Whiskey Rebellion. Another of those seemingly straightforward lines in the preamble of the Constitution saying what had gone wrong under the Constitution, under the Articles of Confederation, what are we going to fix with the Constitution, provide for the common defense. Seems pretty straightforward. The only thing I want to say to complicate that is the Native American role in getting that clause put into the Constitution. There's Ohio, there's the plans once Virginia and New York had been forced to give up their dibs on Ohio. They started deciding, okay, this is how we're going to divide it up, and we're going to pay some out to soldiers. A lot of that'll get bought up by speculators. We're going to sell some directly to the speculators and settlers, although actual settlers didn't get much of it. But I want to focus on that first little bit that they wanted to sell off, the first 7 ranges, as they called them. They failed to do that under the Articles of Confederation. They passed a law to start selling off this land in 1785, but they never sold an acre to actual settlers under the Articles of Confederation. And the reason is this guy and others like him, that is, Native Americans, resisted the efforts of the United States to encroach on their land. And the United States realized that we're never going to successfully take land from Native Americans until we have an army powerful enough to do that. So there's a second reason to junk the Articles, replace them with the Constitution, and that is to have an army that can be used against Native Americans. And I know it's boring to read a line off the PowerPoint screen. I'm only going to do it once. Here's an amazing line from John C. Miller's book, which comes from a document that I've seen generated in the early, by the federal government in the early 19th century. But look at this stat. From 1790 to 1796, almost 5/6 of the general experiences of the US government were swallowed up by the war in the West. That is, out of every $6 the federal government spent on operating expenditures, it was also spending money paying off its debt, which I'll say something briefly about in a minute. But of operating expenditures, 5 out of every $6 was spent fighting Indians. So I'm going to suggest something radical here myself as I put back up the phrase, provide for the common defense. If they're using most of that money to drive Indians off their land, is it accurate? It's accurate now to say provide for the common defense, because that's what we mostly have is a Department of Defense, not a department. But shouldn't we really, for when the Constitution was adopted, call it provide for the common offense? That is, to have a federal government that can tax us, to field an army to take land from Indians so that we can have it. Then we'll fight over whether settlers get it or speculators get it. We'll later fight over whether the North or the South gets it. That's the Civil War in a nutshell. But at the moment, we want to have a federal government that can take the land from the Indians, and that's provide for the common defense. I'll put it back to defense. Okay, and then the final phrase I want to pull out of the preamble to the Constitution is establish justice, which again sounds like, whoa, we're all for justice, and we are, but it had a very specific meaning at the time of the Constitution. And I'll come back sometime and talk about the economics of why the Constitution was adopted. It's a little bit beyond my purview this afternoon, but I will tell you in a nutshell that there were two groups who really felt cheated during the period of the Articles of Confederation. And it wasn't the Articles of Confederation's fault, it was the state's fault, because the state governments weren't turning in money to the federal government to pay off its debt. That debt was owed to Americans, as is still the case with some of our debt today. A lot of you probably, if I were asking for a show of hands, own US savings bonds. You are a creditor to the US government. The US government owes you money. Well, after the Revolutionary War, federal government owed money to the soldiers and the people, farmers, for instance, that had sold cattle and horses and grain and stuff to the Continental Army, and they couldn't pay them cash, so they gave them IOUs. These IOUs mostly got bought up by speculators, and so you had all these speculators who wanted to be paid back. But I told you, the federal government didn't have any taxing authority, didn't have any money in the treasury. It couldn't even field an army, so it definitely didn't have money to pay back its debts. And so you had all of these creditors who had pieces of paper saying the federal government owes me money. The federal government wasn't paying them, so they had a natural interest in getting creating a federal government that could levy taxes to pay them back. So they had a very selfish interest in adopting the Constitution, but there were other Americans, and I'd put Madison and Hamilton and Washington in this category. The government didn't owe them a lot of money. They owed George a little bit of money for all of his expenses during the war. He very nobly didn't take a salary, but he did ask for his expenses, which turned out to be a wise move. Anyway, these weren't people, they weren't asking for the federal government to be able to pay off its debts out of selfish reasons, but because they knew if the government doesn't pay off its current debts, no one's going to lend money to it in the future. And so that's who they wanted to establish justice for, federal creditors, also the state creditors. These guys wanted the federal government to assume the state debts and actually pay them off. The states were sort of too democratic in the eyes of many people.
One side's diagnosis.
Oh, that's me talking from before. Sorry, let me get rid of that. I thought I'd eliminate all those. Shut up, me.
Alexander.
There, I'm just going to go past that one. Hopefully it won't happen again. That slide that I'm having to skip because I forgot to get rid of audio for something I did before. The phrase that I want you to get from that previous slide, and well, of course we'll put this up on Humanities Texas's website as well. The phrase was excess of democracy. The two extremes of the Constitutional Convention were Alexander Hamilton, who basically wanted us to have a king in the United States, and on the other side, Elbridge Gerry, who ended up voting against the Constitution. So these are the two extremes among those 55 guys at the Constitutional Convention. They both Hamilton and Gerry used the same expression to describe the problem out in the states, and that was an excess of democracy. And so this is the third and final reason that many people, all of the people who worked on who signed the Constitution, what they thought was wrong with the Articles of Confederation was not really a federal problem, but a state problem. And that is that the 13 states were too democratic. There's some other expressions of the same idea. My favorite is just the bottom one there. Democratic licentiousness. That's what's wrong. That's what we've got to fix. And how do we fix that? That state level problem? We take some of the crucial powers of the states, such as the power to levy taxes to pay off the war debt, and we transfer those powers to the federal government. And I'll do a little not prop humor, but a little bit of a prop here. Pretend this is my kid's Halloween candy. My kids have no self-control. And so I can let them eat a little bit of candy, but then I put that Halloween candy on a high shelf where they can't reach it. And that's what the Constitution did. It took some of the powers away from the states and gave them to a federal government that was much less responsive to the desires of the ordinary farmers. And so this is not me speaking, but this is me channeling James Madison or Alexander Hamilton. Those state legislatures, they'll give those farmers whatever they want. And the farmers will say things like, I don't want to pay any taxes. And if the farmers don't pay their taxes to the states can't turn money over to the federal government. That means the federal government has no money because it can't levy taxes of its own under the Articles of Confederation. So that's what's wrong with the way things were before the Constitution. And we're going to change that. Madison and Hamilton and the other authors of the Constitution said, we're going to change that by giving the federal government the power to take care of things like paying off the war debt, and something that I'm not going to go into tonight unless you want me to in Q&A, and that is handle things like paper money and relationships between private debtors and private creditors. My creditors are American Express and whatever bank owns my Visa card, and the other bank that I owe money on my house to. You and I all have creditors. If you didn't pay cash for your car, then you've got a creditor there. Oh, I said I wasn't going to talk about this, and I am. Anyway, there were battles between debtors and creditors, and according to the guys who wrote the Constitution, the state legislatures, like Pennsylvania with its extremely democratic Constitution, they were too responsive to the will of the voters who didn't want to pay their taxes and didn't want to pay their debts. And so the Constitution transfers all those powers, the power to levy taxes to pay off the war debt, the power to print paper money. When I say this in Massachusetts, I can say it safely. None of you has any Massachusetts paper money in your pocket. Here in South Carolina, there's sometimes somebody says, well, actually, I do have some South Carolina money left over from 150 years ago. And there are probably Texans who could say that as well. But the Constitution bans state level paper money. Only the feds can do that because the people who wrote the Constitution trusted only the feds to do that. I'll just go back and show you this slide. Again, because you guys are very much a cattle state and a cowboy state. It's amazing how many people at the time described the goal of the Constitution as pulling in the reins. Under the period of the Articles of Confederation and state sovereignty, the people had gotten out of control, and they had absolute control over their state governments, and the federal government had almost no control. And that's what we got to do. We got to rein things in, I can't see the watch. Yes, I can. As Washington said, let the reins of government be braced and held with a steady hand. That's what the Constitution does. And so there they are, pulled from the preamble. Here's what's wrong with the Articles of Confederation. It's not ensuring domestic tranquility or providing for the common defense or establishing justice. We'll do all of those things with the Constitution. We'll wrap up with one slide just pointing out that there's another side to this argument. A lot of people who didn't think that the state governments were too democratic. In fact, a lot of people wanted them to be even more democratic. This is a cartoon that ran in 1787, done by Amos Doolittle, the same guy who did those famous prints of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. If I zoom in to the hay wagon there, you see it's the state of Connecticut. This is not a cartoon about the Constitution. This was done before the Constitution was adopted later in 1787. But you've got two parties in Constitution in Connecticut. The one on our left wants to pull the hay wagon out of the mud in that direction towards a stronger federal government, and the ones on the right are trying to pull it in the opposite direction. They want to tax luxury, as the guy is saying out of the side of his mouth. And I'll put my mouse over. See, he's saying tax luxury. It's just like the debate right now. You know, President Biden and Democrats want to put wacko high taxes on the super rich, and the Republicans are saying no, that they're job creators, blah blah blah, and they pay too much taxes already. I'm not taking an opinion on that tax, but there's a big question about taxing luxury that's still with us today, and that was one side of this argument. They're the ones who said, no, we don't have to tax farmers more. We don't need a federal government that can tax farmers. We can do that. We can fund the state governments just by taxing luxuries. I haven't done justice to that side of the debate, but that's because I didn't have time, but I could in Q&A.